An average man sat on the fringe of the gathering. He had hazel eyes and brown hair, but he didn't have any distinguishing features. Wearing a three-piece suit, he sat silently on the edge of the gathering, looking at his tablet. Gary Harris and Belinda Cummings were one couple attending the joint dinner dance at the wedding rehearsal. Belinda was around 5 feet 8 inches, with short curly brown hair, and Gary was about 6 feet 1 inch, 200 pounds, with blue eyes, wavy blonde hair, and a smile. She was a tall, striking woman with deep gray eyes. Her cup size was approximately 38C, but it was at least 36C. Melissa Foster and Jason Witten made up the other couple. Jason didn't stand 6 feet tall. He used to joke that he wanted to be 6 feet tall in life. His somewhat lengthy dark brown hair gave him a rough appearance. Depending on the light, his dark brown eyes appeared to turn black. Both women were stunning, and both men were very attractive. Everyone agreed that they were the ideal couple. Belinda and Melissa had only known each other since their junior year of college, but Gary and Jason had been friends since the first day of elementary school. Melissa was only 5 feet 5 inches tall, and her long blonde hair reached halfway down her back. Her breasts were smaller than Belinda's, but her body proportions were perfect. Gary walked around the room chatting to the patrons. Most of them were people he knew, but a few were visitors or relatives he didn't know, so before the food came, he made an effort to introduce himself to as many people as possible. Eventually, Gary noticed a man sitting by himself with a clipboard, so he went over to sit in the chair next to him. Jason smiled and held out his hand. "Hi, I'm Gary Harris, one of the groomsmen," said Gary. "Hello, my name is Preston Fulton, but everyone calls me Press," the man said, shaking Gary's hand. "Are you here for this bride or some other groom?" Gary inquired, grinning more broadly. "Actually, I'm here for you and for Jason," the man replied. "But I need to talk to you first, and then, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to talk to you and Jason together." "I'm afraid you have an advantage over me," the man said, sounding more than a little uncomfortable. "What exactly do you need to talk to me about?" Gary thought this request was strange and wanted to know more before agreeing to anything. "What exactly do you need to discuss with Jason and me, by the way?" Press took an envelope out of his pocket and said, "I think this letter will explain most of my intentions. I'll speak with Jason alone if, after reading it, you decide you don't want to hear from me anymore." When Gary first opened the envelope and started reading, he was taken aback by the fact that the letter was from his father, but what really shocked him was what was inside. "The fact that I must send Mr. Fulton to deliver this message hurts me so much, dear son. To put it plainly, Mr. Fulton has evidence that Belinda cheated on you. It is my request that you follow Mr. Fulton's advice after viewing the evidence. He works for a firm that I have hired because they provide much more than just evidence of your future wife's adultery. I ask that you pay close attention to Mr. Fulton and accept his word for it. You are loved by my mother and me, and I sincerely apologize for the hurtful way in which you were betrayed. I'll always be here for you if you need someone to talk to once this sad affair ends. Greetings, Dad." Gary could not believe what he was reading in the letter, so much so that he read it several times. Belinda was his future wife, and he loved her more than anything. She was smart, funny, and beautiful, and how could she cheat on him? His father had to be mistaken. The letter was a fake, but the signature was real. Gary just didn't understand what he was going to be getting into. Gary, his anger rising, remarked, "I don't believe what my father says. If it were true, he would have told me so himself." Press took a business card from his wallet and said, "Let me introduce myself." Gary looked at the card and saw that it said, "Me Inc." in the center and Preston Fulton, field representative at the bottom right. The map made no sense, and Gary didn't try to hide his confusion or suspicion. "This Inc., what the devil is it?" "It stands for male equality," inquired Gary. "Simply put," Mr. ___ exclaimed, "what the hell is this?" Gary was now furious beyond measure. The women's liberation movement has done a fantastic job of disenfranchising men over the last few decades. The goal of our organization is to bring back gender equality. The National Organization for Women has unquestionably harmed young men, especially boys, in its current form. What? Gary shot back. I've never heard anything like that, and what does that have to do with Belinda lying to me? Nothing about your fiancé betraying you. Press calmly responded, but our organization was founded to fight back against the unjust laws that are now in place and to protect young men and boys from the hatred directed at them by these women's organizations. But she feels entitled to do so because of the garbage spewed by the NOW organization. For example, most elementary school teachers are women, and study after study shows that these women consistently give boys lower grades than girls, Press said, pausing for a moment to make sure the young man was still watching him and not lost in thoughts of his fiancée. Throughout his school career, a boy might not hear a single encouraging word about being a man. We are genuinely creating wimps generation after generation. An increasing number of young men are electing to remain at home with their parents after graduating from college. Men are enrolling in colleges at a decreasing rate, and even fewer of them pursue careers in academia. Me Incorporated is dedicated to turning this trend around. Gary was on the verge of a nuclear explosion at that very moment, having been the happiest man alive 10 minutes earlier. He had to find out if what had been said about Belinda was true. All right, that may all be true, but where is the evidence of Belinda's infidelity? Gary inquired. Press put his hand on the young man's arm and said, "Remember your father's advice before I show you the evidence. I ask that you pay close attention to what I have to say and do as I say. You'll want to see your fiancé right away once I show you the videotapes. Of course, you want to exact maximum revenge on everyone involved, but if you do that, you'll be denying yourself that chance. Furthermore, I want to be clear that this is about more than just getting even. The suggestion I'm about to make should be interpreted as a clear act of treason. So, are you going to stay composed for me?" Gary's hands started to perspire and his heart started to beat much more quickly, but in the end, he nodded. "I still want to talk to you and Jason, whether or not you decide to jump on your fiancé tonight." Press added, "This talk will help shield you both going forward, even though it won't help you handle the current situation." Satisfied, Gary nodded once more. Mr. Fulton pressed the launch triangle on the screen and gave him the tablet. A few seconds later, Gary noticed Belinda chatting up some random guy. The video showed no time or date, so he shrugged it off, figuring he'd slept with plenty of women before getting engaged to Belinda and wouldn't hold her responsible for her extramarital affairs. Then another video began, which infuriated Gary even more. It featured Belinda being entertained by an ex-boyfriend, and the date was stamped 2 days after they had decided to date only each other. He brought it up because they had decided to be exclusive for New Year's Eve, and the video was dated January 3rd. Still, Gary decided to overlook it if it was just one instance of a relationship ending, but the next 3 videos proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Belinda was a cheater, since they were recorded during the 6 months that he and Belinda were engaged, and even included some of his friends. The final video nearly sent Gary into a rage during the rehearsal party. It featured a picture of Belinda and Gary's best man. "I suppose these little get-togethers will end after your wedding," said Gary's best man. "No way," laughed Belinda. "I love Gary to bits, but I like you too." Spencer Tolliver having sex in Gary's apartment, and the audio recording was what almost made Gary erupt. "I'll make arrangements for us to meet up." Press watched as Gary, appearing to be about to pass out, took a bottle out of his pocket, opened it, waved it in front of Gary's nose, and handed him the water bottle that was at his feet. "I feel kind of bad about having fun with old Gary," Spencer laughed, "but I'd be crazy to give it all up." "Do you feel better now?" "Your response is fairly typical of someone who has been caught off guard," Mr. Fulton inquired. "Take solace in the fact that you learned about Belinda today rather than 10 years from now, when it's possible there may be children. I'll explain how we're going to handle this in a moment. It would be best if Jason knew about it before the ceremony tomorrow," Press added to Gary. "Even though Jason isn't facing the same problem as them, they both need to hear what he has to say." After Gary had gathered himself together somewhat, Press asked him to get Jason and encouraged Gary to tell his friend about Belinda. The future of the two of them depends on this knowledge. A few minutes passed before Gary finally forced his friend to separate from the groom. He then insisted that Jason needed to meet someone on the way out, whispering in his ear until Jason abruptly stopped and said, "No way," but Gary reassured him that it was true. After a somewhat awkward encounter, Jason initially refused to stay, only agreeing to stay after Gary gave a more detailed explanation of what he had just learned about Belinda. Like Gary, Jason initially didn't believe it, but Mr. Fulton showed him 3 photographs that made Belinda's betrayal crystal clear. After both men took their seats, Press set up a clipboard so he could record their conversation. He then went into great detail about the organization he worked for, and every time he conducted an interview like this, Me Incorporated would criticize it and find better ways to protect its members, grow the organization, and spread information. Press would later review his presentation and see if he had missed anything, and then he would send a copy to headquarters for review. Press apologized to Gary once more for his fiancée's mess, and he gave him a packet containing a detailed schedule of what he needed to do at the ceremony. Press also gave each of the young men a book that explained Me Incorporated's mission, listed some of the organization's problems and how they needed to solve them, and included a list of recommendations that any married man should heed. The book was meant to supplement the guidance that Mr. Fulton had given the young men. Mr. Fulton stayed a few more minutes to make sure Gary didn't snap at his fiancée. He nodded approvingly when Gary told Belinda that he had stomach problems and was heading to his parents' house, where he was staying because of an old superstition that the groom was not to see his bride until after the wedding. He also explained that their fathers had paid for lifetime memberships for their sons. Mr. Fulton also gave his approval when Gary just gave Belinda a quick peck on the cheek and walked away. If the bride had any doubts, they were kept to herself, and for the remainder of the evening, she danced and drank, some of the dancing creating confusion, but people were understanding because it was Belinda's night before her wedding. Press grabbed his coat from the check-in area and made his way out, noting that he had another appointment tonight. Press stepped outside into the cold Ohio night, the temperature hovering around 20 degrees, but the blowing wind made it seem much colder. Snowflakes were flying, and the overcast skies seemed to promise a blizzard. Press had to be at the church tomorrow to oversee Gary's wedding, and the following day he had a meeting. Then, thankfully, he would be able to go home to his family with his winter coat on. Press hopped on Interstate 20 and drove into East Cleveland. With the light traffic this time of day, it was easy to locate the Cleveland Clinic's main campus, which spans many square blocks. Finding the right building was also a breeze, and the nearly empty parking lot made finding a spot, which was a major hassle during the day, a breeze. Press went to the main counter to check in as soon as he arrived at the building. His supervisors had given him the paperwork he needed to enter without any problems, and after a few wrong turns, he found the cafeteria and proceeded to look for his next assignment, which was, fortunately, mostly done. The majority of the details had already been completed in the office, but a few still needed to be completed on site. Press took the picture out of his pocket and scanned the cafeteria, seeing Ben Sharpen, 49 years old, but with a build that suggested he was at least 10 years older, seated alone at a table against the far wall at nearly 240 pounds. He had gray hair with hints of blonde, but gray predominated. His skin was pale, his shoulders hunched, and he appeared to be a battered man. Press wasn't sure Mr. Sharpen had ever smiled in his life, looking at him. "My name is Preston Fulton, Mr. Sharpen," Press said. "You can call me Press if you want. I work for a company called Me Incorporated. We work to help people like you." The man shook his hand and got to his feet. "I'm glad to have met you," he remarked. "But as I told you on the phone, you can't tell me anything about my ex-wife, Connie. That would shock me. And I'm sure there's nothing you can do to help me. The truth is, I don't give a damn what Connie does or who she does it with. As for my kids, they're not worth blowing up. I think I have some information that you will find very interesting," stated the Press. "But before I begin, why don't you tell me about your marriage and divorce?" Ben said, "Not much to tell," and shrugged. "It was a shitty marriage. Connie and I got married right out of high school. The first 2 years of marriage weren't bad. I felt like we really loved each other. But then things started to change when she got a job at that brokerage firm. Her attitude changed, and I was already thinking about divorce. But then she got pregnant, and that's when I was at an impasse. Eventually, she was fired, and we moved. Things got better for about a year, but when she went back to work at the law firm, things went south again. Then she got pregnant again and quit her job. With 2 kids and a wife like Connie, it wasn't a good situation. But I stood my ground for the kids. However, I thought about divorce for a long time. But then Connie announced that she was pregnant again. What a waste of my life. Mr. Sharpen took a sip from his coffee mug and shook his head. He then let out a sigh. We were married for about 12 years, and then I caught her with a UPS man in our bed. I immediately filed for divorce. Stupid me didn't hire an expensive lawyer like she did. Of course, I had to pay her attorney fees since Connie was out of work. I got very little sex from Connie in the last years of our married life, but the court screwed me big time. Press said, "Tell me about the final divorce decree." I became head of the X-ray department and started making decent money. After the judge got done with me, I was left with about what? When I first started out, I was making mistakes. I had to pay the mortgage and property taxes when Connie bought the house. For every child, I also had to pay Connie child support and alimony. The fact that I'm paying so Connie can stay at home and enjoy herself with her lovers really irritates me. They are probably laughing hysterically at my expense. That makes it clear why I have no interest in anything Connie does. After speaking with multiple attorneys, they all advise me that there is nothing I can do. Press remarked empathetically, "Your case is one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice I've seen in recent memory. I think action needs to be taken to change the situation. I appreciate your sentiments, but I only have 2 alimony payments to make, and I'm free of those rotten children of mine. Connie has been turning them against me from day one. If any of those kids were burning, I wouldn't cross the street to piss on them to put out the fire. As for Connie, if she was burning, I would cross the street, but that would be to pour gasoline on her. So, there's nothing I can do right now, but I appreciate that you care. You're one of the few people who took my side." Press placed a briefcase on the table and opened it, saying, "I know you feel helpless, but there are a few things you don't know that will change the game significantly." Ben asked, a little curious, "Like what now?" "First things first, none of these 3 children are yours, Mr. Sharpen," Press said, removing the DNA tests and setting them on the table. Ben pounded his fist on the table and cried out, "That damn fool!" All eyes in the cafeteria turned to us as the place fell silent, but after a short while, everyone returned to their dishes. Press then noticed that Ben appeared to retreat into himself. He spoke quietly. "It's not much of a relief anyway, because I'm almost done paying alimony. At least I won't have to feel guilty for hating those kids." Press smiled and said, "No, Mr. Sharpen, your relief is just beginning. Let me explain. You may or may not have to pay your last 2 child support payments. We know who the fathers of all 3 children are. 2 of them work at a law firm, and 1 works at a brokerage house. All 3 are married and are partners in their firms. We just filed papers to sue them for all the child support you paid for their children. They will be forced to pay you back tens of thousands of dollars. The wives of all 3 men will be informed of their infidelity. I don't know if their wives will divorce them or not, but there's a good chance they will." Ben sat in disbelief. "Is it really true?" "Absolutely, and I'm not done yet. You still have a lot to learn, and we right any wrongs done to you." Ben questioned, his face showing concern, "Why are you doing this for me? I can't afford to pay you anything. I'm barely making ends meet as it is." "Stop worrying, Ben," Press said instantly. "This is being done pro bono. As I explained before, the company I work for is primarily concerned with correcting the injustices done to men. It is time that both men and women truly have equal rights." "Wow, I didn't know there was such an organization," Ben said. "But how do you pay for everything you do?" "Simply said, we use interest from our capital fund," Press responded. We attract new members all the time. New members pay a one-time initiation fee of $1,000, then they pay an annual fee of $250. They also pledge to help if their expertise can be of assistance. Lifetime membership costs $100,000. All money raised goes into a capital fund. We use the interest to fund our projects. Currently, our capital fund is approaching $2 billion. We also have some major benefactors who fund our lobbying efforts and very generously contribute to our endowment. Ben objected, saying, "But I didn't pay you guys anything. And like I said, I don't have any money to spare." Again, Ben, calm down. It won't cost you anything. About 20 or 30 times a year, we take on cases pro bono. Your case is one of those. Me Incorporated takes care of all expenses. Ben said, "I'm not sure how to thank you," with gratitude. "I'm not done telling you about everything we're going to do on your behalf, but if you want to thank us, live well," stated the press. Ben just nodded and then, for the first time that night, grinned. "All right, let me go on," press started up again. "Your ex-wife has not been honest with the court. She does have a source of income, but it's not legal. She is a drug dealer. And while you were still married, she was selling them. We discovered where she had hidden the money and closed her accounts. She'll discover all of her money is lost tomorrow, but that won't be the first piece of bad news. We have your old house searched by the police. Connie has recently made the decision to increase her activity and carries enough drugs to be regarded as a significant supplier. Furthermore, we think the evidence is strong enough to connect the drugs Connie sold the adolescent to his death. We anticipate that she will receive a minimum 15-year sentence. In addition to being charged, all 3 of her children will also face lengthy prison terms. Yes, all 4 of her ex-boyfriends will perish simultaneously. If Connie ever walks out of prison, she'll be an old woman." Ben's eyes grew quite wide as he attempted to process what he had just heard. "Now let me tell you the most important thing of all, that brokerage house and that law firm that employed the people who got your wife pregnant are being sued for allowing their partners to take advantage of you and your wife. We expect them to quietly pay you a 7-figure settlement each. When that money arrives, you will be able, if you wish, to purchase a lifetime membership in Emmy Incorporated. However, since you are in a pro bono business, you are not required to do so." A smirk passed from one of Ben's ears to the other one. "I don't know if any of this is true, but just thinking about it makes my spirits rise, and certainly if the money comes in as you say, I'll be sure to buy a lifetime membership." Press went back to his room after Ben signed a few papers. He was eager to get a good night's rest in preparation for tomorrow's wedding. The previous day's blizzard had lessened, and the sun was shining brightly. Press had no doubts the bride would be happy. It was still only about 20 degrees, though, so it wasn't too bad. Press took his time, poring over the paper for an hour, since the wedding was set for 1:30 in the afternoon. Press threw the paper on the ground after rolling it into a ball when he was done. It had been part of his training to identify media bias. This morning's paper contained at least 5 articles endorsing the views of women or denouncing a supposed crime a man had committed against one of them. Not that the man was probably guilty of what the article said, but rather the fact that the article was featured on the front page and gave the crime a lot more weight, irritated Press. This was the standard for the majority of newspapers and magazines, films, TV news, and TV shows all shared this same bias. Press was seated on the groom's side in the rear of the church at 1:45. After taking a seat, he searched the area for the cameraman. When Press could find none, he got up and began to search. Press would have to use his portable camera if the person tasked with recording the service wasn't present. The quality of the footage would be poor, so he wasn't really in the mood to do that. Press eventually found the videographer sitting by the railing when he ascended to the balcony. Press saw that he had picked the ideal location for the shoot when he came downstairs. When he ran out of things to do, he went back to his seat. The organist, who had been playing a variety of pieces, abruptly stopped at 1:30 and launched into the wedding march. The groom's friends and Gary, his best man, were already gathered on one side of the altar. With her father's arm around her, the bride started to slowly make her way down the aisle. The two white screens faced the congregation as they were gradually lowered to the side, approximately 10 minutes prior to the start of the service. Gary Lewis Harris, do you take Belinda Marie Cummings to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, in sickness and in health, in wealth and in poverty, leaving all others? Until death do you part, the priest said, breaking the silence for a few drawn-out seconds. Today is a glorious day when a man and a woman will vow to each other in holy matrimony. It is the beginning of a lifetime of loving, working, and helping each other become more than they would have been. All he did was stand there and look at Belinda. The wait for an answer caused the gathered guests to start whispering. Subsequently, Gary turned to face the pews and firmly said, "No. That cheating expletivist cannot be my wife." Gary hit a button on the remote, and the screens instantly filled with video of Belinda enjoying herself. Belinda and her mother screamed, and chaos broke out. Some people got up and fled the church as fast as they could. The press observed Spencer's now 6 shades paler face expression. Gary moved closer to Spencer at that point. "Gary, me," murmured the groom. Before he could say anything, Gary struck him with his right. Spencer took the blow to the bridge of his nose, and the crack of bone was audible to all in the church. Blood spurted from all directions as Spencer flew backward, landing partially on Gary, but also injuring the priest and the front of Belinda's wedding gown. Belinda's mother attempted to console her as she fell to the ground and started crying uncontrollably. Red-faced, Belinda's father stood over the two women. His daughter in the screen caught his attention in turn, and his expression was one of pure disgust. He growled at last, saying, "Belinda, please don't come back to our house." With the exception of Jason, the groom's friends started to act as this drama developed, but they were unsure of what to do. Jason raised his hand and took a step toward them. Jason yelled menacingly, "That thing on the floor is a piece of expletive." The 4 groomsmen turned to face the screen, then back to Jason and said, "If you want to defend it, you are no friends of Gary's or mine." One of them said, "I want nothing to do with that expletive." "What a piece of expletive," as the others all shook their heads. Jason approached the unconscious Spencer and gave him some assistance. "Listen, Spencer," Jason said with a raspy voice, "you know you're a piece of expletive, and everyone here now knows you're a piece of expletive. We've been friends all our lives, and this is what you did. Not only were you supposed to be Gary's best friend, you're also an ADA. How do you think your boss is going to react when he gets that copy on his desk on Monday? And I think the copy that gets sent to the Bar Association is going to get you in a lot of trouble. So why don't you do everybody a favor and get the hell out of here? Oh, and lose our phone numbers." Spencer maneuvered to get away from Jason and vanished through a back door of the church. Gary, in the meantime, removed the package that Mr. Fulton had given him the previous evening and concealed it behind the column to the altar's right. He pulled out photos of Belinda with different men from it and started giving them out. After showing the photos to the groomsmen, Gary finally decided to show them to Belinda and her mother. Gary placed a dozen pictures in Belinda's lap and said, "Here are some pictures to help you remember this special day." She gave him a pained glance. Gary simply shook his head and smiled. "I'm so sorry, Gary. I really love you." "Let me see if I'm understanding this correctly," he replied. "You're expressing your love for me by having fun with Spencer. You really are an expletive, Belinda. You desperately need help, but luckily that's not my problem. Good luck with the rest of your miserable life." She yelled after him, "Please, Gary, give me another chance." Gary tossed the photos onto the pews and walked down the aisle, answering over his shoulder, "No way." After that, his father reached him and touched his shoulder. His father looked at Gary and smiled sadly. "Come on, Gary. I think we should all go. The reception is already paid for. I think we should at least get something to eat for our trouble," he said. Gary said, turning to face Belinda's boss, an older, well-built man with gray hair. Give me a second, Dad. There is one other person I want to be sure to show these pictures to, Gary said. Belinda had been employed by a reputable financial planning company owned by him for the previous 2 years. Gary Harris said to Belinda's supervisor, Mr. Turner, I'm Gary Harris. You probably don't remember me, but you and I met at your company's Christmas party. Yes, Gary, I do remember you, Mr. Turner said as he stood up and gave his wife a helping hand to stand. Gary held out 6 photos and said, I'm so sorry about how things turned out. I'd like to give you these pictures. There's no need for that, Gary. I've seen enough. Oh, these pictures aren't for you, Mr. Turner, Gary said, holding them out to Mrs. Turner. These pictures are from Mrs. Turner. They are pictures of you and Belinda. You spread her out on your desk and made a good deal of fun of her. I hope you enjoy these pictures, Mrs. Turner, as much as your husband and Belinda enjoyed this moment. Gary then turned to his father. I'm ready to go now, Dad. Press smiled as he recorded this exchange after consulting with the videographer and making sure he knew where to send a copy of the recording. Press headed back to his room. He needed to write up his report and review the videotape he had made of his conversation with Gary and Jason. The report was pretty straightforward. Press went over it twice to make sure he had included everything and hadn't messed anything up. Press then pulled out his clipboard and reviewed the conversation with Gary and Jason. He kept a checklist next to him to mark off each item as it was explained. The first thing he talked about was the mission of Me Inc. It was very simple, to ensure that all men are treated equally under the law and to help Me Inc. members who are being cheated on by women or men. Those present watched and listened as he explained that current divorce laws treat men worse than second-class citizens. Even if husband and wife are equally good parents, the courts almost always award primary custody to the woman. Not only that, if the woman did not work, she is almost always awarded alimony. There was no opposition to alimony per se by Me Inc. What they did oppose was unlimited alimony, which thankfully has not been allowed in many states. At some point, a woman should be forced to get a job, and the sooner the better. Also, Me Inc. recommended that instead of placing children with only one parent and allowing limited access to the non-custodial parent, a different arrangement be worked out. This new custody plan, if implemented, provided that the parents would change residences every 2 weeks. The children would not have to move, and both parents would get significantly more time with the children. The next part, according to Press, was especially important for men who are not married but are in a relationship with a woman. He explained to them as emphatically as possible that they should always use some form of contraception. He warned them never to believe women who said they were on the pill or unable to conceive. Press spent quite a bit of time on this issue because if a man isn't careful, the woman he has sex with could get pregnant. And since the feminist movement planted the belief that a woman had complete control over whether or not she would have a child, this gave her complete reproductive control to the detriment of men. Although Me Inc. did not object to women deciding for themselves whether or not to have an abortion, they did object to women refusing to accept economic responsibility if they chose to keep the child despite the objections of the man. The woman had the right to decide to terminate the pregnancy, but the man had no say. If she decided to keep the child, the courts regularly forced the man to pay child support. Me Inc. believed this was a travesty of justice. The telephone in the room startled and worried Press. He rarely got a call when he was in the field. Press always called his wife every night, and if she called, it meant it was something urgent. Once in a while, the office called. Press, pausing on his tablet, picked up the phone. "Hey, Turner. Something's happened," said Press's boss, James Baker. "I'm very sorry, but you're going to have to extend your stay here for another day." "Oh, what's going on?" "We have another project scheduled for the next day in a can, and the designated representative on site has the flu. Everything is already set up, you'll just need to be present for the taping. Make sure you'll be allowed to film everything. I need more than just an audio recording of the meeting. The usual bonus for the extra day has already been approved and will be included in your next paycheck." I've got my camera charging right now, so no problem, and I never turn down extra money, Press grinned, but you know me, I'd just as soon spend an extra day. That's how much I believe in what we do. I always appreciate your attitude. I will email you all the details of the new assignment. We have rebooked you on a later flight, so don't worry about that. Again, I apologize for tearing you away from your family. Hopefully, your flight will be able to leave before the big snowstorm hits. 15 to 20 inches of snow is predicted to fall after the call. Press waited for the letter to load before opening it. It turned out to be an interesting case of a wife who dreamed of becoming a movie star. Her husband was a very successful screenwriter in film and television. He had just finished his latest script for a very successful television series that had been running for 5 years. Even though they wanted him to stay, he had other things to do. During the 5 years of their marriage, his wife, without realizing it herself, had had numerous affairs. All of them were with people in the industry who the wife thought could advance her career. She was now dating one of Hollywood's biggest stars, Kirk Southern. He had promised to cast her in his next 3 movies. Press looked into all the logistics of this project to make sure everything was provided for. This was not his responsibility, but he did it regardless of how involved he was in the project. This project was well planned and perfectly executed. He then looked through his email and found information about the new flight. Finally, he turned his attention back to the video. Press had always found the men's reaction to one of the Me Incorporated presentations interesting. This was the case with both Gary and Jason, but it was the next item that Press shared that elicited the most response. Press addressed the topic of DNA testing. This was one of the biggest lobbying efforts of Me Incorporated. They hoped that every state would pass a law that would require DNA testing of all newborns. Too few fathers do DNA testing of their children when they are born. If the new law were passed, it would allow paternity to be established right away. It would also allow potential health problems in newborns to be identified. The problem with establishing paternity for men was that if it was not established within a fairly short period of time, the father could find himself stranded and paying for children that were not his. In many states, courts ruled that men only had a short period of time to prove that they were not fathers. After that, cuckolded men had to pay for the children even if they knew who the real father was and could prove it. There was no guarantee that the courts would make natural fathers pay. If the new law had been passed, it would have allowed a man to stop paying at any time for children who were proven not to be his. In the present situation, the cheating wife was rewarded, and the innocent husband was punished. 22222222222222222. Press continued to watch his presentation on his tablet, noting each point as it was discussed. However, he paused the video when he reached one particular section. It was an issue he had never considered in his first marriage, the issue of his wife's refusal to have sex. His first wife wanted sex all the time and, as it turned out, wasn't too picky about who she had sex with. While money was still the number one issue causing discord in marriages, sex was at the top of the list. The laws had changed in the last 30 or 40 years, and now a husband could not force his wife to have sex with him. The press was in favor of this, but here the question arose, why get married? The press couldn't imagine anything more humiliating than a husband wanting to have sex with his wife and her refusing him for no good reason. To address this problem, Maine Incorporated recommended that all men insist on a prenuptial agreement. It was strongly recommended that they sign a prenuptial agreement before marriage. This was recommended regardless of whether or not they had property. Of course, this agreement prescribed the division of property in case of divorce, but it went much further. It also contained a clause that penalized one spouse if it was proven that he or she had cheated. Instead of a 50-50th split, it would be split 70-30ths, with the lion's share going to the spouse who did not cheat. It was also recommended that the agreement include a clause that at least one day a week be set aside for sex. This way, the husband did not have to worry about being rejected. It also stipulated that if either party refused to honor the terms, it was grounds for an 80-20 divorce with property division. Of course, the spouse who refused to have sex would only get 20% of the property. Despite some doubts about the philosophy of Maine Incorporated, the press supported the organization 100%. He himself participated in pro bono assistance when his cheating first wife tried to out him. Press knew that without their help, he would have had to live an even worse life than he had with Ben. The next day, Press was up early because he had an appointment at breakfast with a rare assignment. Today, he was to meet with Janet Arnold. Yes, he was to meet with a woman. It didn't happen often, but when the situation did, Maine Incorporated was fully prepared for action. Press saw a woman sitting in one of the back booths. Her 2 children were sitting on the inside of the bench next to their mother. The boy, who Press thought was about 7, was sitting by the window, and the girl, who looked to be about 5, was sitting next to her mother. Both had sand-colored hair and were coloring with crayons on their placemats. They were both wearing a variety of clothes that protected them from the cold. They looked content for the moment, but glanced at their mother from time to time to make sure she was still around. Janet had dirty blonde hair that she was trying to put in a semblance of order. She wore no makeup and looked haggard. Once upon a time, Press thought Janet must have been quite beautiful, but now she was a little overweight, and her eyes seemed dull. Even from across the room, it was obvious that Mrs. Arnold was at least 6 months pregnant. But Press took comfort in the fact that he was to relieve some of her suffering. When Press was first sent on a case like this, it really surprised him so much so that he questioned why he was helping a woman. He thought it was the job of Maine Incorporated to help men. Mr. Wagner, a senior vice president, heard the question and immediately stepped in to clear the air for the new company representative, Mississippi Stefan. He said cheerfully, "I think you should reread your textbook. We strive for true equality between the sexes, not the one-sided policies that feminists preach. It's true that we primarily help men, but if one of our members is cheating on his spouse, we'll help the woman if we can." The longer Press worked for the organization, the more he appreciated Maine Incorporated. It was not trying to bring back the old days when women were effectively the property of their husbands. On the contrary, Maine Incorporated wanted the laws to be fair without favoring one sex over the other. The organization wanted to restore the sanctity of marriage and punish as many cheaters as possible. "Mrs. Arnold, thank you for meeting me," Press said, lowering himself into the booth across from her. "I hope you don't mind, Mr. Fulton," she asked nervously, looking back at her children. "But my mother hasn't been able to watch the kids." "Not at all," he said with a smile, turning to the 2 children. "I hope you're hungry because I hear the pancakes here are amazing. They put whipped cream and sprinkles on them." At the mention of food, both children raised their heads. Press felt a slight pain in his heart. He could see that they were hungry. The thought of his children starving made him sad. "You don't have to do that, Mr. Fulton," Janet protested. "You told me you found my husband's small account and you know how I can access the money. Ever since Dad left us, money has been tight. If you tell me how to do that, leave you?" "Nonsense," Press said, beckoning to the waitress. "In fact, I have many things to share with you, and I'd like to talk to you about some of them in private. But right now, I think we should order breakfast, and I'll tell you everything I think you need to know." It was obvious Janet didn't want to impose, but Press wasn't going to back down. Finally, after looking at the pleading eyes of her children, she gave in. With Janet's approval, Press ordered pancakes with whipped cream and sprinkles for the kids. He also ordered bacon, hash browns, and a glass of chocolate milk for each child. Janet ordered scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee, and Press ordered a Western omelet and coffee. After coffee and chocolate milk were served, Janet introduced her 2 children. The boy was named Michael, and his sister was named Terry, which was Teresa's nickname. They were actually 7 and 5 years old. In very simple terms, Janet explained that her husband, Simon, had run off with his secretary, Tammy. He left behind a bunch of bills, kids, and no money. Simon had disappeared, and Janet had no idea where he was. When the food had been delivered, and the children were concentrating on devouring their pancakes, Press began. "I assume you knew your husband had been married before?" Janet nodded. He told me she was a witch and tried to give him the purge. Exactly, Press said, pulling a folder out of his briefcase. They were only married for 2 years, but his first wife, Mary, found out all his passwords and stole all his money. Then she even planted drugs in his car and house. Your husband was facing years in prison until we intervened. I don't understand, Janet said, setting her fork aside. Who do you represent, and how did you help Simon? I guess the easiest thing to say is that we're like an insurance company, and your husband bought a policy to protect himself from being cheated. And Mary didn't turn out to be as smart as she thought she was. For one thing, she left her fingerprints on one bag of drugs. We also arrested her supplier, and he turned her in. Then we found out where Simon's money had been transferred to and recovered it. This explanation seemed to satisfy Janet, and she went back to eating. When I first called you, Press said, opening the folder, I had just begun my investigation. Normally, I wouldn't have contacted you so soon, but I knew how desperate you were for money. In any case, since we last spoke, I've managed to uncover a lot more of your husband's assets. He's really doing quite well for himself. Did you know that? Janet shook her head. Thad took care of the money. I took care of the kids and the house. So far, I have determined that he absconded with about $2 million worth of liquid assets, Press explained. In addition, he has partnership interest in 3 businesses where he is a silent partner. He receives about $100,000 a year in income from these 3 businesses, Mrs. Arnold. There is every reason to believe that you are entitled to your husband's 1/2 interest in these partnerships. Janet sat in her seat with her mouth open. After thinking for a moment, she leaned forward and said with deep sadness in her eyes, That may be true, but I don't have the money to fight my husband. I can't even afford a divorce lawyer. So, there's nothing I could do, Mrs. Arnold. I don't want you to worry about this anymore, Press said, patting her hand. We've arranged for an excellent attorney to handle your case. He'll be contacting you later today. As for paying for his services, we already have a court order that your husband will be responsible for his bills. In addition, we have located your husband. He went to Costa Rica with his girlfriend. But he has been served with divorce papers and is in custody pending extradition. All of his assets are now frozen, except for the modest amounts that the court has ordered to be paid to you and Tad for living expenses. Tears streamed down Mrs. Arnold's face, and she began to tremble. This isn't a cruel joke, is it? I assure you that everything I have told you is true, Press reassured her. And I have put all the documents to back up my words in this envelope, which you can take with you and read later. Before you leave, I will give you access to the first account. You can transfer the money or just withdraw it. But right now, I'd like to talk to you in private. Do you mind if we sit at the empty table over there? You can watch your children, but they won't hear what I say next. Janet gave Press a strange look, but after telling the children to behave, she moved to a nearby table. They were still fully engrossed in their pancakes and chocolate milk. As soon as Janet was seated, Press began discussing the sensitive part. Your husband, as it turns out, is not a very nice man. But I suppose you've already guessed that. I don't know when he turned into the scoundrel he is now, but he made a very bad mistake. There is a clause in our insurance policies that spells out the penalties if he breaks any of the rules. Not cheating on his wife is the very first rule. A look of confusion appeared on Janet's face. Fines? What kind of fines? I don't understand. Well, most of the wealth your husband will have left after you get your fair share will go to pay his fines to me Incorporated. He won't go bankrupt, but his standard of living will drop significantly after he gets out of prison. Prison? Janet said louder than she wanted to. What's he going to jail for? He will be convicted of tax evasion and currency violations. I can't tell you how much time he'll get, but I'm sure he'll spend at least 6 months in jail. And I'm sure you don't care about his secretary, Tammy, but for your information, she's stuck in Costa Rica with no money. All the research I've done convinces me that she's nothing more than a gold digger. It's going to be very difficult for her to get back to the United States since Dad put their passports in a safe deposit box, and Tammy doesn't have access to them. A smile lit up Janet's face, and then she started laughing. After getting Janet to sign some legal documents, Press said, standing up, "I've got to go." But before. He put on his winter coat, then pulled an envelope from his pocket. "Here's $500. I want you and the kids to buy some proper winter clothes, and then I want you to have a wonderful life." After Press said goodbye to the children, Janet kissed him on the cheek. "I really don't know what's going on, but I thank you from the bottom of my heart." Press paid the bill on the way out and headed to a can. It was there that an additional project was to be realized. The next day, Press went to a conference room in the office of Moreland, Connor, and Stiles. These attorneys represented Beverly Bracken in her divorce proceedings. Gloria Connor was the attorney who handled the filings and negotiations. This firm had a reputation for almost always winning in divorces. They were particularly cruel to the spouses, but today was not one of those days. In fact, it was the worst loss in the firm's history. Paul Bracken was represented by a rather unassuming middle-aged man, Elliot Chalmers. He looked more like a poor British civil servant than a lawyer. Paul, Elliot, and Press sat on one side of the table, with Paul sitting between the other two men. On the other side sat Mrs. Bracken, Gloria Connor, a court stenographer, and a secretary who was just putting her elaborate notary seal. Press studied both Paul and Beverly. Paul was certainly better looking than the average guy, with black hair and an attractive personality. He entertained Press and Elliot with stories about working in Hollywood. Beverly was a strikingly beautiful woman. Her blonde hair, blue eyes, and stunning figure caused instant awe. But after your first reaction, you would begin to realize that there was something off about her. Perhaps it was her smile, which never seemed to reach her eyes. She just didn't seem quite sincere. Regardless, Beverly was stunning, and it was obvious why Paul had married her. Before we begin, Press stood up and placed his camera bag on the table. "I'd like to set up my camera to record this meeting," he said. "That's impossible," Gloria said with a wave of her hand. "We don't allow filming in our offices unless it's a court deposition. So, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to put the camera away." Press looked at Elliot, who immediately spoke up. "If we can't get this production off the ground, then we're out, and the deal we agreed to is off. We'll have to start from scratch." "You can't do that," Beverly said anxiously. At that moment, Kirk Southern poked his head in, nodded to everyone, and looked at Beverly. "I just wanted to let you know I'm here." Press looked around the room, and everyone, even Gloria, had a dreamy expression on their faces. He grinned to himself. Beverly looked pleadingly at Gloria, who finally nodded her head. "Okay, Mr. Fton, you can set up your camera," Gloria said, snorting irritably. "I think we can make an exception." Once the camera was set up and working, they began discussing the details of the divorce. The house was to be sold, and the proceeds divided. But Press knew that because of the current real estate market situation, he had very little equity. The money was also to be split 50-50. However, there wasn't much because Paul was mostly writing, and they were living on royalties from the last television series he created. As for the royalties, Paul agreed to give them to Beverly instead of alimony. "Bev, just so we're clear," Paul interrupted, "you get royalties from the Gobbler Twins television series. Since I'm giving you all rights to it, you waive any claim to my stamp or comic book collection. In addition, you relinquish any rights to any work I have done or will do in the future." "I don't need your stupid comic books," Beverly said dismissively. "I have everything I want." One of the last items was a child support clause for Sarah Bracken, who was almost a year old. Gloria objected to the wording, which stated that Paul would pay $1,500 a month to support any children he and Beverly had. "I'd rather Sarah be named directly," Gloria insisted. "Look," Paul said angrily, "I don't want anything more to do with that woman who will soon be my ex-wife. She's someone who will spread her legs for anyone. I know this is true because Beverly had sex with me right before she served the divorce papers." For all I know, she has a bun in the oven right now. I don't want to go back and do it again. The agreement still stands, unless you want to renegotiate everything, Ms. Bracken. I will not tolerate that kind of profanity, Gloria said, her face flashing with anger. And I think the wording in this agreement needs to be changed. I'll go along with the wording as written, Beverly immediately stated. Gloria tried to talk her out of it, but it was clear that Beverly wanted to finalize the divorce. Finally, they checked the last item, and Paul and Beverly signed the document. Then the witnesses signed, and finally, the notary stamped it. One copy was given to Beverly, one to Paul, and each lawyer kept a copy. All set? Asked Paul. When everyone nodded, he stood up and announced loudly, "Thank God it's over, and I'm not married to that damn woman." Beverly and Gloria flinched at that expression, but it was Gloria who spoke. "I've already told you that I won't tolerate that kind of expression. I think you'd better leave before the guard throws you out." Before Paul could answer, the door opened, and Kirk walked in. Beverly walked around the table and kissed him, then she put her arms around his waist and grinned at her ex-husband. But to the surprise of most in the room, Kirk extended his hand to Paul. "Hey, Paul, how's it going?" "I'm doing great, Kirk," Paul said, squeezing the movie star's hand. "I'm no longer married to that cheating woman who's hugging you. I'd heard she had such a reputation in Hollywood, but I didn't believe it." Kirk removed Beverly's hand from his waist and took her hand. "But apparently, you're right. Still, I won the bet." "Yes, it was," Paul laughed, "but it was worth it." "What are you two talking about?" Beverly asked in confusion. Kirk smiled at her and released her hand. "I've known Paul since college." "What's the bet?" Paul and Kirk laughed together. Now Gloria and her assistants were as confused as Beverly. "Well, Beverly dear," Paul said with a smirk, "I bet Kirk that he wouldn't succeed in seducing my faithful, loving wife." "I lost, but Kirk, you said you loved me," Beverly said with tears in her eyes. "You said you'd marry me as soon as I was divorced." "Beverly, when you married Paul, you promised to leave everyone else behind," Kirk said, shaking his head and smirking. "When I found out about the other men you slept with after the wedding, that was the deciding factor." Now Beverly broke into real sobs. It took 5 minutes before Gloria was able to calm her client. When Beverly had more or less calmed down, Paul sat down next to her. "Beverly, I'm a little slow, but I really thought you loved me," he said, taking her hand. "But I have to admit that you were good. I didn't know anything until a year later. I was so angry, I wanted to divorce you immediately. Then I thought about Sarah and decided I had to be patient. But when I took a DNA test and found out she wasn't mine, I decided you needed to be taught a lesson." Beverly turned white when Paul mentioned the DNA test. "That's why you insisted on that language," Gloria said through clenched teeth. "You set us up. The whole thing was an embarrassment. It was done to deceive my client. I want the entire divorce petition canceled." "Good luck to you," Counselor Elliott said with a drained smile. "My client wasn't trying to trick anyone. According to your client, she got everything she wanted. If any fraud was committed here, your client did it by trying to pass her child off as Mr. Bracken's child. If you think you have a case, try your best. As far as I'm concerned, I like the evidence we have in this chamber." There was silence in the room, only Beverly sobbing. Then Paul spoke. "Beverly, look at me." His ex-wife looked up. Paul sighed. "I'm going to be honest with you. I thought that if I humiliated you, it would give me pleasure. But it didn't. I loved you with all my heart, and even after I learned of your betrayal, some part of me still loved you. Kirk is right about your reputation. Every producer and every director knows you'd spread your legs to get a part. I guess I was the only one who didn't know your true character." Beverly was panting, and Press couldn't help but notice her breasts rising and falling with each breath. As Press watched, it became obvious that Paul still had feelings for Beverly. "Remember the day you got a part in my show, The Goblet Twins?" Beverly nodded. "I was so happy that all my hard work had finally paid off. And you didn't lift a finger to help me. That's where you're wrong, Paul said, shaking his head. It's true that I told you that you had to do it yourself. But as I've watched you try and try again and fail, I did help you. I never told you that I interceded on your behalf for the part you got. You're lying, Beverly snapped back. I earned that part myself. That's what I wanted you to believe, Paul said. The truth is, I had to make a deal with the studio to get you this role. I had to limit the number of years I would receive royalties. That's why they will end in about 2.5 years. Beverly's face showed shock. Gloria's face turned bright red as she suddenly realized her mistake. She didn't inquire about the status of the royalties, only made sure they were paid. Gloria felt a crushing humiliation, however, that humiliation paled in comparison to what Beverly felt. The thing she was most proud of had only come about because of her husband's sacrifice. Beverly began to sob again because deep down, she seemed to accept the truth. I also want you to know that I will not abandon Sarah, Paul said affectionately. She's not my daughter, but I have feelings for her. I have instructed Mr. Chalmers to set up a trust fund for her. So far, I have invested $200,000 in it. Here's the corrected version. I intend to increase this amount until it reaches $500,000. If I have the opportunity, the interest from this trust will be used for Sarah's care. Beverly, you will never have any control over this money. You will only be allowed to present bills, which will be audited, to pay for Sarah's maintenance. When Sarah turns 25, the trust will be transferred to her. As for you, I urge you to keep the money coming in from the serials. You're going to need it. The truth is, Beverly, you are not a very good actress. However, with your reputation, you can probably get small roles until your looks start to fade. I'd advise you to choose another career, but if you don't mind spreading your legs to get roles, go ahead. A look of pure hatred appeared on Beverly's face. Paul seemed to have hit a nerve. As angry as she was, Beverly said nothing. Instead, she turned to Kirk for comfort. Paul exhaled and shook his head sadly. In all my life, Beverly, I don't believe you've ever truly loved anyone but yourself. But one day, you will find love, and I hope you won't be betrayed like I was. Paul paused and looked at Kirk, then back at Beverly. However, I fear that today is the day you will know that pain. And if that is the case, you have my sympathy. Slowly, Paul rose to his feet. Beverly, this is the last time we're talking. If you have anything to report to me, do it through Elliot. Take care of Sarah, or the wrath of God will come upon you. Paul looked around the room, then shook hands with Elliot and the president. After patting Kirk on the shoulder, they left together. Beverly put her head down on the table and sobbed pitifully. Press quickly gathered his equipment, picked up his car, and headed for the airport. His flight was the last one before the airport closed due to the impending snowstorm. A year later, Preston Turner settled into the chair across from his boss, James Baker. It was time for the annual review. Press knew that all of his cases were periodically reviewed. As soon as he filed them, but during the annual review, his boss looked at cases that Press felt should have been closed. Today, Press hoped to close 3 cases from Cleveland and 1 from Akron. After reading Press's highly commended annual review, the two men moved to review the cases to determine if they should be closed. Analyze this project with Gary and Jason. Tell me why you think they should be shut down, Mr. Baker ordered the president, Gary Harris, and Jason Witten. Press read from his folder. If you don't remember, the two were supposed to be married in a few days, but we discovered that Gary's fiancée is a serial cheater. Gary completely humiliated Belinda at a church service and walked out. Yes, I remember that video, Mr. Baker nodded. I almost felt sorry for her. Apparently, she really loved Gary. But anyway, how is she feeling after her cheating was discovered? Belinda left Cleveland. She eventually ended up in Las Vegas, where she works as a waitress and part-time dealer. She keeps in touch with her mother, but her father refuses to communicate with her after her failed marriage. Belinda continues to date several men. I believe that she is incapable of maintaining fidelity. Unfortunately for her, however, Belinda seems to still have a memory of Gary as she writes to him periodically. He has apparently forgiven her, as he occasionally responds to her letters. However, there is absolutely no chance of reconciliation in the future. Gary is actually dating a certain Linda Choser quite seriously. If my sources are correct, he intends to propose to her within the next 2 months. What about the best man? How was he treated? Actually, we didn't have to do anything. The district attorney fired him, and the Bar Association suspended his license for 5 years. He lost all his friends and left town shortly after the marriage fiasco. Belinda's boss, his wife, ripped him off in the divorce. He is by no means poor, but he has lost half of everything, and his 3 children do not speak to him. What about the other guy, Jason Witten? He married his fiancée, Melissa, and from the looks of it, they are very happy. Besides, Melissa signed a prenup without any objections. Oh, and they're expecting their first child any day now. Mr. Baker smiled. I approve of the closing of both these cases. Now, tell me about the Ben Sharpen case. As we had hoped, Ben was able to sue and get the birth fathers to pay him back the child support he was paying for their children. However, Ben was able to accomplish much more than just getting his child support money back. As you know, we found the money that his ex-wife was hiding overseas in the drug trade. After taking the amount of alimony Ben was paying her and $300,000 for his pain and suffering, we told the IRS where the rest of the money was. The lawsuits against the law firm and the finance house were quite successful. After deducting legal fees, Ben received almost $2 million. All 3 birth fathers were divorced from their wives. 2 attorneys got their wives to sign prenuptial agreements, but those were rejected because their husbands did not ensure that the individual attorneys representing their wives reviewed the agreements. All 3 received large sums in the divorce. As for Ben, he left the Cleveland Clinic and opened several medical clinics of his own. In addition, he got a girlfriend, Linda Crawford, who used to be a nurse at the Cleveland Clinic and now works for Ben at one of his clinics. Ben also joined a gym and has lost 40 pounds so far. What about his ex-wife and her children? Mr. Baker pressed. Mrs. Sharpen was convicted of several charges, including drug dealing and income tax evasion. The heroin she sold was proven to have caused the death of a teenager. She was sentenced to terms ranging from 20 years to life. Her children received prison terms ranging from 5 to 7 years. Her 4 most recent lovers also received prison sentences, but I did not inquire into their length because they were not part of this project. Great job, I approve of closing this one as well. The Janet Arnold case gave me particular pleasure, press continued without waiting for a response. I am particularly pleased with the result. Mrs. Arnold and her children were so spoiled by one of our members that I was ashamed. I remember the case, Mr. Baker admitted. It was discussed at several executive meetings. Do you think it can be closed now? Yes, sir. The final judgments are in, and Mrs. Arnold has received half of the property we were able to find. At first, I thought there was more money somewhere, but from the state of Mr. Arnold's affairs, I'm sure we got everything. And how is good old Mr. Arnold after Mrs. Arnold got her share? We paid Mr. Arnold's taxes with interest. As you know, we never pay interest to the government because it can take them 3 years or more to determine that they are owed additional taxes. Because of the government's incompetence, we don't believe they are entitled to interest. Nevertheless, when it was over, Mr. Arnold was left with less than $200,000. Since this amount exceeds the maximum amount allowed to be retained for breach of contract, I was prepared to proceed with the case. However, one of his partnership investments went bad, and he lost all but about $30,000. He is now selling used cars. What about the other 2 partnerships? Even receiving half of his share of the income would exceed the maximum allowed to cover his part of the losses from the failed partnership. He had to sell his interest in the other 2. However, we were able to get Mrs. Arnold's claim satisfied before he sold his shares. She is now receiving the income that is rightfully hers. And here's another thing, Press smiled, pulling out a sheet of paper. There seems to have been a mix-up in the paperwork for the extradition warrant. Mr. Arnold had to spend 3 months in a Costa Rican prison. He went in there a little overweight and came out skinny. Apparently, the marshals were pissed because they had never seen a man so happy to be back in a U.S. prison. Just out of idle curiosity, PR's boss asked, "What happened to the woman Mr. Arnold ran off with?" "Ah, Tammy," Press smiled. "It took her almost 2 months to return to the United States after a life of poverty in Costa Rica. I dare say she has a new appreciation for America. Anyway, because of her behavior with her previous boss, she had a hard time finding a new job. She eventually landed a position as an administrative assistant. As far as I can tell, she has not returned to her gold digger image. Nevertheless, she will be monitored, and if she returns, and it is with one of our members, we will take action." "I want to be cautious," said Mr. Baker, studying the report. "Perhaps we'll leave this case open for a while longer to see what Tammy will do and to see if Mr. Arnold has any more money stashed away. Now for the last case, Mr. Paul Bracken. I know what it was, but I'd like you to familiarize yourself with its results. The divorce was contested, but the court dismissed it. Mr. Bracken is now producing a new television series called Runaway Husbands. He made a deal with the studio that owns the series. Since its release, it has been in the top 10. It's already been renewed for 2 years. And the funny thing about this show is that the role of the narrator, in my opinion, would be perfect for Paul's ex-wife Beverly. I can't help but believe he wrote the show with her in mind." And whether Mr. Southern was able to escape Beverly's clutches, Mr. Baker grinned. Their relationship ended that day. And I believe that Mr. Bren was right when he said that Beverly would fall in love and perhaps one day be betrayed. From my observations, Beverly did love Kirk and was crushed when he left her. She didn't see him for 6 months after that and only dated him sporadically. Beverly now works as a real estate agent, and as far as we can tell, she's not currently sleeping with anyone. It seems that Beverly spends most of her non-working time with her daughter Sarah. She's turning out to be a much better mother than I would have guessed. Oh yeah, she also performs occasionally at the local community theater. It's not exactly your project, but I figured since you're coming to me, I'd take a look at it. Based on the results, I'm ready to shut it down." Finishing his review, Press began to rise. "If you have nothing else, I'll get back to work." "Yes, I have another matter I want to discuss with you." Mr. Baker waved at Press, and he returned to his chair. "What could it be, sir?" "As you know, we recently crossed the 2 million mark, and our growth is faster than expected. We need more representatives in the field, and we are in great need of qualified regional supervisors. I just received authorization this morning, and you are being promoted to one of those supervisory positions." "Congratulations." Press was stunned, but still managed to thank Mr. Baker. "You deserve it, Press. Your work has been exemplary. You will begin work on Monday. However, I want to warn you that 3 or 4 of the projects your new team is working on are going very badly right now. I'm sure you'll be able to fix them. Good luck." They shook hands, and Press, beaming, walked out of his boss's office. "Greetings. If you found these contents valuable, please consider sharing them with your friends and family. Additionally, if you've enjoyed this video, a simple click on the like button would greatly support our podcast in reaching a wider audience, as YouTube's algorithm favors such engagement. Subscribing to the channel for notifications whenever new content is uploaded is also highly encouraged. Thank you sincerely for your support, and may you have a wonderful day.